Mr. Chairman and Administrator Giles, good to see you. I'm appreciative, and I always think it's important to emphasize that everybody on this committee certainly is focused on making sure we have the cleanest air and cleanest water in the country. Certainly something that's a big issue in my state, in Alaska, where we do have some of the most pristine environments and clean air. But you know, one of the things I've raised on the committee a lot is my concern about legal issues where I think the EPA is not following the law. I think it's not just us, but it's frequent court cases. And it also relates to the area that you're in charge of in terms of enforcement and compliance. I want to talk a little bit about the summer of 2013 in Alaska. Are you familiar with what happened in Chicken, Alaska during that summer?
Generally, yes.
So that was when I think it was 7 armed EPA agents, rifles, body armor, several ATVs, made a raid, anything less than calling it a raid, on a placer mining operation of a bunch of Alaskans who were out placer mining, looking for Clean Water Act violations. The state of Alaska did an extensive report on that, and one of the things that you talked about, working closely with law enforcement, they said that there was actually very little coordination with law enforcement when you came in, scared the living daylights out of a bunch of Alaskan miners looking like, the U.S. Army as opposed to the EPA. Have you learned any lessons on coordinating better with state officials on something like that? The governor's report in Alaska said that there could have been a terrible tragedy, terrible accident, a bunch of EPA enforcers coming in, rapid raid. What have you learned in terms of, you said that you're focused on working closely with law enforcement. What have you learned from that raid?
Senator Sullivan, thank you for the question. As you know, the governor's special counsel did do a review of that situation and found that the investigation was done professionally and courteously. And I would add, not just by EPA, but we're accompanied.
I don't think so. Did you find any violations of the Clean Water Act in that investigation?
The information about that was found was turned over to the state and to prosecutors for their evaluation.
The answer is no. There was no Clean Water Act violations in that raid that was conducted. How much does EPA spend on training your officials, your agents, in terms of high-powered military weapons and arms training? Let me get to just a more direct question. When the EPA started out for the first 20 years, you did not have armed agents. Why do you believe you need armed agents now when your initial 20 years you didn't have armed agents? Why do you need armed EPA agents now? And you spend millions of dollars training, weapons, bullets. Why do you need that? Why can't you rely on, for example, if you go to Chicken, Alaska, why can't you rely on the state troopers to work with you, force cooperation and coordination so they can go in if you think it's dangerous? But why is the EPA spending so much money on having armed agents when the first 2 decades of your agency's existence, you didn't have that?
Senator, the reason that was sought and the reason that Congress decided to give that authority to EPA was because the mechanism that was working up to that point was not working well. President Reagan is the president who specifically sought that authority. In his signing statement, he said, "I am pleased to sign this bill into law because it contains the explicit law enforcement authority for the environmental, excuse me, the Environmental Protection Agency, which this administration actively."
Well, my first amendment as a U.S. Senator, my first bill was actually to disarm the EPA because I don't think you need the weapons. I think it would force you to actually cooperate, which you didn't in the Chicken, Alaska case, with local law enforcement, and to have them be in charge of any kind of weapons in terms of any kind of dangerous mission. I still think that the vast majority of Americans don't know that we've had a dramatic increase in the arming of our federal bureaucracy. I'm someone who's a strong Second Amendment supporter. I believe in armed citizenry, but I don't believe in an armed bureaucracy. And I think that I'm going to continue to work with my colleagues here to throttle back on this area of the federal government's increasing power to arm federal agents. I think the EPA has not shown that it needs these weapons, and I think that that's something that the Chicken, Alaska raid in particular demonstrated. Let me turn to the Gold King mine site issue. If a private company had released 3 million gallons of contaminated water into a river, would your office have charged them criminally or brought civil or criminal charges to a private company that did something like that?
Senator, the law and an enforcement distinguishes between the company who makes and releases pollution and the entities that are trying to respond and clean up pollution that other people created. So in the case of EPA's action in Gold King, we were acting as a responder, trying to prevent releases of pollution that were left there by others.
The EPA administrator told us in a committee hearing that she would hold the EPA to a higher standard than a private sector company. There's been numerous instances where the EPA has actually criminally charged people who accidentally, not on purpose, have polluted rivers with much less amounts of pollution. Why has nobody in the EPA been held liable, been criminally charged? The EPA administrator told this committee she would hold the EPA to a higher standard, and yet nothing's happened. And if a private sector company did this, it's likely that the CEO or some members of that company would actually be in jail right now. You have not demonstrated any commitment similar to what the EPA administrator said she would do, which is hold EPA to a higher standard than the private sector. How come that's not happened?
I totally agree, Senator, that EPA
You agree with what?
I agree that EPA is responsible and that we should hold ourselves to the same standard or higher that we would expect from a private party.
And why does that not happen when people have gone to jail for doing something less than you did?
In the event of a response action, when someone causes a spill as part of a response action, not pollution they created, we generally do not assess fines or pursue them for violations as you're discussing here. Though we do that in the case of someone who creates the pollution and is responsible for releasing it.
Didn't you create the pollution and release it?
We did not. We were responsible for the release. The pollution was not created by EPA. We were attempting to remedy the pollution that was left there by someone else.
But for the EPA's action that day, would the Animas River have been polluted?
I totally agree we are responsible for that. And what we expect from private parties when they're in that situation, if they're doing a response action and they make the situation worse, we expect them to fix it. And that's what EPA has been attempting to do.
But no one's civilly liable or going to jail, as has happened in the past.
EPA does not typically assess penalties or pursue enforcement actions other than to get response parties to clean up the mess that they made. And that is what EPA is taking responsibility for doing, which we should do.
I think what we will do